Today's lecture is by Dr. J. Michael Alson, Professor Emeritus of Music at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. A specialist in the sacred music of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, he's published articles and reviews in several scholarly journals and standard reference works. An active program annotator, he's written for orchestras and festivals around the country since 1984. Alson is also a performer playing with the Madison Symphony Orchestra, bass trombone, from 1983 to 2018, and in many all-festival orchestras over the years with MEMF.
Hello, my name is Mike Alson, and I'm a longtime faculty member and participant at the Madison Early Music Festival. As you've probably noticed, this is not a normal year. I'm coming to you from my basement instead of a lecture hall in the Humanities Building. Like many good things, the Madison Early Music Festival had to be canceled this year, thanks to the plague. And we have put together some really wonderful online virtual content. We can't have the festival, but we can still have early music and learn about it. So we have little concerts by three of the groups that would have been appearing at the festival this year, by the Orlando Consort, Pifaro, and Nota Bene. There are some lectures by myself, by Bill Hudson, and Peggy Murray. And finally, on Saturday, there's a wonderful chance to sing along, a virtual sing along in place of our beloved all festival concert. So I hope that you'll tune in for some of that. My job over the last couple of years has been to do what I think of as the lead-off lecture. I try to do a historical lecture which talks about the time and place that provides the basis for that provides the theme for the festival that season. This year it's 14th and 15th century Burgundy. And that lecture usually doubles as the pre-concert talk for the All Festival, which of course, unfortunately, is not happening. But we can still talk about Burgundy. And so I'm going to be devoting some time to Burgundy during the time of the Valois Dukes, and I'll explain all that as we go through. So first of all, there you go. First of all, Burgundy takes its name. Burgundy, as many of you know, is a today a part of France, a county in France, just southeast of Paris. And it takes its name from one of a number of Germanic invaders, Germanic tribes that came into what's now France during Roman times. In the early Middle Ages, Burgundy, which is not very big, actually constituted two small kingdoms and a duchy, and the duchy actually became much more important in history. At about the turn of the millennium, in 1004, the duchy became a fiefdom of the King of France, meaning that it owed allegiance and military service and loyalty. And the ruling dynasty of France at this time was the Capetian dynasty, who ruled France well into the 14th century. And a sort of junior line of the Capetian family took over as Dukes of Burgundy, and that was an unbroken line into the 14th century until the last of the Capetian dukes died in 1361. In 1363, the French king, who now was a member of the Valois dynasty, named his son as Duke of Burgundy, and there's actually a whole series of 4 Dukes of Burgundy from the Valois line who ruled the duchy for over a century. So we'll talk about each of these guys in some detail, but let me give you the lineup here. So at first Duke of Burgundy, we have Philip the Bold. Second Duke of Burgundy, we have John the Fearless, who has a wonderful example of what's sometimes known as the Valois nose. His son, Philip the Good, the longest reigning and probably most successful of these dukes, And then finally, Charles the Bold, who's known to history also and probably more accurately as Charles the Rash, or sometimes Charles the Reckless. So before I launch into each of these dukes in turn and talking about music at the Burgundian court, I wanted to talk about their overall concerns. What were their main preoccupations in this well over a century of Valois rule in Burgundy? Well, not surprisingly, these are uncles and cousins of the French royalty, and so they're very heavily involved with French politics, sometimes in opposition, and they get involved with a couple of very long and bloody civil wars, in particular the Armagnac War, which I'll discuss in a little bit. Um, as part of this sort of political machination, they also became very involved with the English, at times actually being allied with the English against the French. Um, and that's one of the reasons I think why English music became so prominent on the continent in this period, is this sort of close political relationship, that and the fact that the English were occupying most of France at the time. But I think the most important concern of these Valois dukes was adding to their territory. Uh, the duchy itself was not very big, but they created this enormous realm over the course of a century through a number of means. First of all, just by military conquest, but also by the game of marriage. Marriages, of course, were political alliances, and the Burgundian dukes were very, very good at choosing their wives to bring them in extra territory. And plus, they were just good politicians. They were good horse traders. They were good at striking deals that allowed them to expand their territory. So I wanted to show you this expanse, the expanse of their territory. First of all, here is a modern map of France showing you where modern Burgundy is. It's a county just, again, southeast of Paris. And now let's go back to the 14th century. This area shaded in orange is actually the original duchy. And it's not very big. If you want a sort of comparison, it's about a fifth the size of the state of Wisconsin in terms of area. So not a very large expanse, very rich, but not very big. And almost immediately, the Dukes of Burgundy turned to the task of expanding that. The next slide shows you these areas shaded in brown. These are areas that were added by Philip the Bold. And almost all of this came to him through his marriage to a very wealthy widow who brought these territories as part of her dowry. The areas shaded in dark green are acquired by Philip the Good, his grandson. And you can see that Philip concentrated mostly on the north. He brought under his control all of modern day Belgium, all of Luxembourg, most of the Netherlands, and quite a bit of what's now Western Germany. By the time his son took over, there were also areas that were effectively under Burgundian control, whether they were very closely allied or in some cases members of their families. The family were the ruling bishop of that area or so forth. And then the last area I want to talk about is the Duchy of Lorraine. This was initially seized by Charles the Bold in 1475. He didn't keep it very long. He conquered it by force, but he was pushed out by a sort of revolution of the Lorrainers, and he was actually killed at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, which is really the end of the Valois dukes, as we'll talk about. So over the course of, 114 years, they put together this enormous expanse of territory, ranging from the North Sea and the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss border. So, and this was very wealthy territory, and it became a real center of court life and of music in the 14th and 15th century. Okay, so let's walk our way through the dukes here. This is Philip the Bold, and Philip earned his nickname at a horrendous French defeat, the Battle of Poitiers. Philip was just a teenager at the time, 13 years old, but was so brave in defending his father and fighting on the side of the French that he earned this nickname, which stuck with him throughout his life. Poitiers was actually a horrendous French defeat at the hands of the English. And in fact, Philip and his father, John II, spent the next couple of years as hostages in England until the French came up with an enormous ransom to get them out of Hock. He was named Duke of Burgundy by his father, and very quickly he made a very, very astute marriage to Margaret of Flanders, who was a widow at the time, and brought with her this enormous expanse of territory. You saw those brown shaded areas in the map. I think Philip's main concern through most of his reign was establishing control over the crown of France. The king for most of this period was his nephew, Charles VI. And unfortunately, I think for the French, Charles was a very long reigning monarch. He took the throne at age 11. And so for the first 10 years of his reign, France was effectively ruled by his uncles, Burgundy and Burgundy's brothers. And then after he took control of the crown himself at age 21, he then spent most of the rest of his life being insane. There were frequent bouts of insanity. And so there was a need for somebody to sort of be in control of France, and Burgundy wanted to be that somebody. There was also the king's brother, Louis, the Duke of Orleans, who, of course, thought that he should be in charge of Charles. And this set up a very long-standing struggle between Orleans and Burgundy over this control. Philip was succeeded by his son, John the Fearless. And John the Fearless also earned his nickname at a horrendous French defeat. In this case, he was at the head of a large Burgundian French army that took one of the last great crusades against the Turks. And at the Battle of Nicopolis, which is in now modern-day Bulgaria, John's army was totally decimated. Almost all of the army was either killed on the battlefield or slaughtered afterwards or sold into slavery, although there were a few very wealthy high aristocrats, including John, who were held for enormous ransoms. When he got back, and took over as Duke, he was pretty warlike for most of his reign. His main concern seemed to be fighting. He immediately picked up his father's beef with the Duke of Orleans, and I don't know how else to put it, but he took out a hit on the Duke of Orleans, and who was killed in 1407. And this sets off a long-standing, decades-long civil war between the Armagnacs, who were the supporters of Orleans, and the Burgundians. And so he picks up this beef, and if that wasn't enough, he also started a beef with the Dauphin, the crown prince, who would later be Charles VII. Probably the two most important events in his reign were, first of all, this assassination of Louis of Orleans, the Duke of Burgundy, had invited him to Paris to a peace conference, and then he was basically cut down in the streets of Paris. On the other end of his reign, the son of Louis actually took out a hit on John the Fearless, and he was killed in turn. Again, thinking he was going to a peace conference. So it was rough politics back then. He was succeeded by his son, Philip the Good. And Philip the Good is, as I said, the longest reigning of these dukes. And in a lot of ways, I think the most important, certainly most important when it comes to talking about music. He continued this war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, although about a decade later, he was able to come to an arranged settlement. And as part of this, he allied very closely with the English, actually against the French. He was instrumental, for example, in negotiating the Treaty of Troyes, which was basically ceded most of France to Henry V of England, and agreed to Henry V's son being king of France and England. Well, he was allied with the English until he wasn't. He switched sides in the late 1490s, the 1430s, and then was nominally enemies with the English, although continued to trade with them. It's important to remember that one of the foundations of this relationship between England and Burgundy was the Low Countries, what's now the Netherlands. And this was the industrial base of Europe. There were woolen mills creating cloth. And there was this very profitable wool trade with England. So they couldn't get too far away from England. He was very, very successful in expanding his territory, especially in this industrial north of Europe. He was very good at playing the game of marriage. He had one legitimate son, Charles, but he had something like 24 bastards, acknowledged illegitimate children, who he also very freely married off and used as sort of political pawns as well. As part of sort of his projection of power, Philip created this tremendously elaborate and extravagant court culture with very medieval pageantry and very complicated court ritual. It was much admired throughout Europe and imitated. And again, it was his means of sort of projecting his power and his magnificence. Among the things that Philip accomplished was the founding of a knightly order, the Order of the Golden Fleece. And this was founded by him in 1430. As the story goes, Philip was actually invited to join the English Order of the Garter and decided that he'd better not. First of all, it would have been nominally treason because he was still a fief of the French king. But he was also at that time starting to edge away from his alliance with the English. Like most knightly orders of this age, the Order of the Golden Fleece was a crusading order. The idea was to go on crusade, to go back and liberate the Holy Land from the Turks. In fact, it never happened. It was an excuse to get together for wonderful pageantry and feasting. The actual name of the Golden Fleece comes from the golden fleece of classical mythology, although it took on all sorts of Christian symbolism in Burgundy. Here's a portrait, for example, of one of the early members of the Golden Fleece, Baudouin de Lemay, who is wearing this elaborate collar. There's a detail of this sheepskin. By the way, Philip was wearing the same collar in the portrait that I showed you a couple of slides ago. Well, I wanted to take a little detour and talk about music, piece of music. This is a song, a monophonic song called La Marmee, and its origins are a little bit mysterious. La Marmee, by the way, means the armed man. Um, we're not sure exactly who wrote it. There are a couple of good candidates. One is Robert Morton, who was a English composer and singer who was active at Philip's court. The other, and maybe a little bit more convincing, is Guillaume Dufay, one of the great composers of the age. I'll mention that one of the reasons that this is an attractive theory is that we know that right around the corner from where Dufay lived in the city of Cambrai, there was actually a tavern called the Armed Man, which is, and when you hear this song, I can always visualize a bunch of guys in a tavern smashing glasses of ale together as they're singing it. It's this rollicking good song. Um, there are probably some connections with the Order of the Golden Fleece. Uh, there seems to be some connections with some of the early masses that were written on this tune. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the text is actually about the armed man should be feared. Everyone should strap on a breastplate of iron and their sword. And there's thought that, this was part of the sort of crusading ideal of the knights. I'll mention that there was a musicologist named Alejandro Planchart who basically was his theory that it was by Dufay, and he noticed that the number of semibrevs, essentially modern measures in this tune, is equal to the number of knights in the Order of the Golden Fleece, which I think is kind of cool. But it became a very popular cantus firmus, meaning it was a tune that polyphonic pieces were based upon, in particular masses. There were well over 40 La Marmee masses written over in between the 15th century and as late as the 17th century. So 200 years later, they're still writing these things. And some of the earliest seem to be connected with the Order of the Golden Fleece and Burgundy. For example, there's a set of 6 anonymous masses that some think may have been by Antoine Brunois, which seem to have been written for Charles the Bold, Philip's son. So I thought I would play this tune for you. I have a nice young sackbut player who badly needs a haircut who's going to demonstrate this tune for you. And I think he's going to transpose it to D. I'll mention that I had to wait for the neighbor's dogs to stop barking before I could record that. I couldn't figure out how to get the birds to shut up, however. So this tune, as you hear it, it's an attractive tune. First of all, it's got 3 short little segments, A, B, A. But it also has some very distinctive melodic features. Bum, 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 this ascending fifth, ascending fourth, and bum, 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 descending fifth. And these are sort of reflective of trumpet fanfares. Again, it's a warlike song. But there are also little features that a lot of composers, when they write big, elaborate polyphonic pieces, will use those features in the other melodies, just in sort of reference. Okay, so continuing this idea of crusading, one of the great disasters of the 15th century from the European standpoint was in 1453, the city of Constantinople fell to the Turks. And this was after centuries of conflict and a very, very long siege by the Ottoman Sultan. And this was viewed as a disaster. There were calls for crusade from the Pope and all through Europe. In reality, nothing ever really happened. But in 1454, Philip held what was known as the Feast of the Oath of the Pheasant. And this was in Lille, which is in the Duchy proper, rather than in some of these extended territories. And this is probably the most important, certainly the best documented of all Burgundian court festivities. And it was basically there to drum up support for a crusade to liberate the Holy Land. But it was also an excuse for, wonderful pageantry and also music. And what's remarkable is we actually know a couple of the pieces of music which were sung at this festivity, which is very, very unusual. And we have some elaborate accounts of this feast written by his chroniclers. And I thought I'd read an excerpt from one of these. So this is a description of the entertainment at the feast. In the grand and spacious hall hung with tapestries, there were 3 tables. On one stood a church with a chiming bell and 4 singers who sang and played the organ when their turn came. On another was a pastry in which 28 living persons played on diverse instruments, each in turn. So these are a bunch of musicians playing from a big pie. First, the church bell sounded, and after the bell had ceased ringing, 3 little choir boys and a tenor sang a very sweet song. These are table decorations, remember. What it was, I cannot say, but for me it seemed a pleasant grace before dining. After those in the church had carried out their task, a shepherd played on a bagpipe in a very novel fashion. First, the church bell sounded, and after the bell had stopped, then, without the slightest pause, a horse came trotting backwards through the entranceway, and on this horse were seated 2 trumpet players. They played a fanfare on their instruments as the horse was led up and down through the banquet hall. After this, the organ players in the church began to play most sweetly, and when those had finished, those from the pastry played the sound of a cornet, playing in a very unusual way and very sweetly. And after this were played from the pastry a lute and a sweet pipe, with yet another instrument in harmony, a thing that was very good to hear. After the church musicians and the pastry musicians had played 4 times in turn, there entered a stag, wondrously large and fine, and on it was mounted a boy of 12. And on his entry, the boy began to sing the treble part of a song, most loud and clear, and the stag sang the tenor, with no one else visible except the child and the artificial stag. And the song they sang was Je n'ai bien le Paris, which is, by the way, a song by Banchois. After this interlude with the white stag, the singers in the church took up a motet, and afterwards from the pastry, a lutenist accompanied 2 good singers. Thus the church and the pastry between them kept things going at all times. Later, from the pastry, we heard a chasse, which is like a round, that imitated the barking of little dogs and the sounding of trumpets, just as if we were in a forest. And the sort of grand finale, climax of this, was an elephant came into the room, whether it was a real elephant or some sort of stage machinery, I'm not sure. And seated on the back of the elephant was a woman who represented the Virgin Mary, and she sang a lament. And this is almost certainly a lament for the city of Constantinople. It was composed by Dufay probably for this event. We actually have a painting of this. This is a court ball at the feast, and in the foreground here we have some of the main characters. Here's the Duke of Burgundy, Philip, and his wife. Here's the Count of Charolais, which is actually his son, Charles the Bold. And then we have the great bastard of Burgundy, who is actually Philip's eldest son, and who was actually a very well-respected and prominent member of the court, was a leader in many of the military campaigns of the time. So the Burgundian court maintained an enormous musical establishment, and it was fortunate in its location. The Burgundian court was able to draw on its musicians from northern France and Flanders, which was kind of a breeding ground for musicians. There must have been something in the water. I mean, most of the great musicians from the 15th century come from this region. Dufay, Banchois, Josquin, Ockeghem, all of these musicians spring from this one area in sort of Northern Europe. And it's not by mistake. There was actually a very well-established tradition in this region of church singing schools. Well, under Philip the Bold, the first Duke, the chapel became enormous. It grew to 28 singers, which was actually larger than the papal chapel at the time, much larger than the chapel of the King of France. And these singers would sing not only the chant associated with the Mass, but also elaborate polyphonic music. John the Fearless had other things in mind, mostly fighting. So he more or less disbanded the chapel initially, although it was re-established in 1415. And then his son, Philip the Good, made it into one of the most amazing musical establishments in Europe at the time. I did a little digging here, and here are just a list of some of the composers who were associated with this chapel, either members of the Burgundian court or associated. And this is like a who's who of several important 15th century composers. Some really big names here. We have Gilles Banchois. And by the way, this portrait, Jan van Eyck portrait, we think is actually a portrait of Banchois. It's probably the very earliest likeness, realistic likeness that we have of a composer. Of course, Guillaume Dufay. Dufay was not, seems to have been sort of an honorary member of the chapel, but he wrote several pieces for Philip. This lament that I mentioned, and also several masses, mass propers that were written for the Order of the Golden Fleece. Heine van Giesingen, Antoine Viennois both served Charles the Bold, his son, and again, very, very prominent composers. He also had a very large corps of instrumental players, of minstrels, and Philip was able to attract minstrels from all over Europe. He had players in his establishment from as far away as Portugal and Italy. And you got some sense of the players, playing from the pastry. Those were all his employees. And by the way, this is not a picture of the Burgundian court, though it may as well be. It springs out of the area of Burgundy in about 1450. This is a page from a romance novel, or romance, The Quest for the Holy Grail. And we have a group of people at a court, and way up here, by the way, tucked away in a windowsill, we have a pipe and tabor player. So this was probably very much like scenes that happened every day at the Burgundian court. Well, this brings us to our final Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold. And Charles actually spent most of his life as Count of Charolais. This was sort of a title in waiting, the sort of the equivalent of, I guess, the Prince of Wales for the English crown. So it was for the heir presumptive to the dukedom. And he actually, with his father's blessing, took increasingly control of the duchy in the 1460s. Charles was not as sort of pleasure-loving a guy as his father. He was quite austere. He was quite warlike, and that's reflected in his rule. But we also know that he was a harpist, and we think that he was possibly a composer. We don't actually have any of his works that survive, but there's some evidence that he actually composed songs and motets. Now, his overriding concern, at the end of this dynasty where they've accumulated this enormous swath of territory, he wanted to actually become an independent kingdom. He wanted to be king of Burgundy. And with that in mind, he was almost constantly at war with his neighbors within France and off to the west, the east with the Holy Roman Empire. And it all ended badly. In 1477, he ended his life at the Battle of Nancy. He kind of rashly attacked a much larger army of Lorrainers and Swiss mercenaries, and his body was found afterwards on the battlefield. This really marks the end of the Valois dukes. Charles had one heir, a daughter, Mary, and she very, very quickly, the old Burgundian realm fell apart. First of all, the French very, very quickly, promptly took control of most of the western territories, including the actual duchy proper. Also, she was forced to allow many of the Dutch and Flemish cities, which had previously been sort of independent city-states, they all sort of reasserted their independence. She ended up marrying a Habsburg duke, Maximilian of Austria, and he later became the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I. And so most of the remaining territory of Burgundy was absorbed into the Holy Roman Empire. So although it doesn't exist today as a nation, Burgundy had a tremendous impact politically in the 15th century, and probably an even greater impact musically. It was sort of the center of music making, one of the great centers of music making in 15th century Europe. Well, thank you for tuning into this. And I hope, as I said, I hope that you tune into some of the other virtual content that we have for the Madison Early Music Festival this year. My name is Mike Olson. Thanks a lot.